Welcome to the Real News Network, and reality asserts itself. I'm Paul Jay. Matthew Fox is a former Catholic priest who was first stopped from teaching liberation theology and creation spirituality by Cardinal Ratzinger, and then expelled in 1993 from the Dominican order to which he had belonged for 34 years. Matthew is the author of over 36 books, including Letters to Pope Francis, Rebuilding a Church with Justice and Compassion, Occupy Spirituality, A Radical Vision for a New Generation, and The Pope's War, Why Ratzinger's Secret Crusade Has Imperiled the Church and How It Can Be Saved. He currently serves as an Episcopal priest and lives in California.
Of course, when I was studying as a Dominican and so forth, I was exposed to, especially when I went to Paris to study, I was very much exposed to the Marxist way of seeing the world. And this was a big part of my education, and of course Latin American liberation theology and so forth that was going on in the late 60s. In fact, I studied with Père Chanou, who many people would credit with being kind of the grandfather of liberation theology, because he comes out of the worker priest movement in France after the war. So he was working with the Marxist unions. That's what the worker priests were doing. And he was the leader because he was the most educated. He was an intellectual, a theologian. He was silenced by Pope Pius XII for 12 years. And he was my mentor. He's the one who named the creation spiritual tradition for me in my studies in Paris. And old voices heard, for example, my mentor, Père Chanou, who had been silenced by 12 years, for 12 years, in the Vatican Council, he became as a peritus with a third world bishop. A peritus is kind of the theologian who accompanies the bishop. But it was the third world bishop who invited him to be his peritus. And Chanou really was responsible for the most radical document called The Church in the Modern World that came out of the Second Vatican Council. And then going to Paris, I landed in '67. So I was there for '68 when the huge events happened that brought de Gaulle's government down and Cohn-Bendit and all the Marxism and everything. And I made good friends with young Dominicans who were studying Marx and theology in Munster, with Johannes Metz, who called himself a political theologian, and people from Spain and of course my closest friend actually was from Spain, and he was involved with the overthrow of Franco. In fact, he was on the first government after Franco was socialist. He was a cabinet minister. He had left the Dominicans by then, and he was like the cultural minister or something.
If studying Marx and engaging with Marxists in Paris is part of the awakening, that doesn't necessarily lead to 34 years in the church. How did the ideas of Marx jive with the ideas of your version of Catholicism?
Well, of course, Catholicism has lived for about 2,000 years, and so it's covered a lot of history, and there's a lot of history there. And so the early church lived in many ways a life of sharing, and in many ways you might even call it a Marxist view of the world. And monasticism too is about sharing. The vow of poverty is about everyone having equal opportunities and so forth. So there's a lot of kind of hidden wisdom within the monastic tradition, I think, about community life. And community means equality. The Dominicans, of course, were a response, as were the Franciscans, they grew up at the same time, to the corruption of monasticism, because monasticism had become too successful under feudalism. And so that's where Francis and Dominic both broke really violently with it in the early 13th century. And when capitalism displaced feudalism. And the vow of poverty under the Dominicans and Franciscans was really an effort to resist feudal privilege and monastic privilege. And to be with the poor, etc. So, you know, there's an amazing history there. And then, of course, later I discovered Meister Eckhart, who's my favorite mystic. He was a Dominican and condemned by the Vatican a week after he died. But Ernst Bloch, the Marxist philosopher, says that Eckhart was a big influence on Karl Marx. Why? Well, he said that he critiqued the having neurosis better than anyone who's ever lived. No, Erich Fromm said that Eckhart critiqued the having neurosis. But Ernst Bloch says that Marx was really influenced by Eckhart, because Eckhart's mysticism was not about escaping the world or flying off someplace. It was about staying in the world and struggling for justice. And Eckhart was very involved in the women's movement, the Beguine movement of the Middle Ages, and the peasant movement. He was the first theologian to preach in the peasant dialect language to the poor. And at his trial, we discovered the transcripts in the late 19th century. At his trial, they said to him, "Why are you preaching to the poor in their own language, telling them that they're all divine and they all there's power?" And they said, if you'd preach like others in Latin, we'd let you go, because this wouldn't disturb the poor people. They don't know Latin. Did Eckhart say, "Oh, I'm sorry, I'll never do it again"? This is what he said. He said, "The poor need to learn, and if they do not, they will never know how to live or why to die." 10 years after he said that, the peasant wars broke out in Germany, and tens of thousands of peasants were murdered. So he was aware of the growing gap between have and have-nots, and he tried to do something about it by supporting the have-nots, giving them their dignity back. And that's why he was condemned, that and his support of the women's movement, the Beguine movement. So it's highly political, and yet he was so deep in his mysticism that in many ways he was very, very Buddhist. I've written about that. Eckhart was very Buddhist.